The general information provided in this talk is for informational purposes only and is not professional medical advice, diagnosis, treatment, or care. Always seek the advice of your physician concerning any questions you may have regarding any information in this talk. I am Dr. Mark Dube, and I've been in family practice for some 30 years. I teach evidence-based medicine at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. I have an emergency practice, and my addiction practice is now 25 years old and largely focused on health professionals with addictions.
My name is Dr. Henry Chapeskie. I've been in family practice for over 30 years in a community near London, Ontario. I'm an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Medicine at Western University. The objectives of our talk are to understand the social and historical context of opioids, as well as the narcotic-induced hyperalgesia and neurotoxicity that exist, and the controversial role of marketing, as well as to gain an evidence-based rationale for the reduction or cessation in the use of opioids, and to explore a population-based model for opioid toxicity.
Now, before we get going, I'd like to show you this painting. It comes to us from the middle of the Second World War, and it's a painting done by Salvador Dali. There are two images on this canvas, and it's really important that you're able to see both of these images. One of the images is that of the bust of Voltaire, representing the age of enlightenment and the pinnacle of morality, and Voltaire is looking into the wife of Salvador Dali's face. The other image on this canvas is that of the slave market, and you can see hopefully three Dutch women in a line, and there's a slave begging for mercy on the far left. This represents the nadir of morality, and is really, as you toggle between these two images, the artist is really reminding us just how much power we have in deciding what we choose to perceive. Now, throughout the vast majority of the 20th century, it was known that opioids were indicated for two things. One was the acute pain, and the other was end-of-life care. Now, in the mid-1980s, Dr. Russell Portnoy spearheaded a movement to introduce a new indication for opioids, and that would be chronic non-cancer pain. Some 25 years after starting his movement, he gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, and he said, "Did I teach about pain management, specifically about opioid therapy, in a way that reflects misinformation?" And he says, "Well, against the standards of 2012, I guess I did." So we're going to go ahead and look at a case study which is going to demonstrate the impact of misinformation on our patients.
The case we're going to talk about is a female that suffered from a failed back syndrome. She had been through 7 surgeries, and at the age of 55, she saw a pain specialist, and at that time was started on long-acting morphine with a total daily dose of 180 milligrams. By age 60, she was still on the same amount of medication, and talking to her, she seemed to think it helped take the edge off. After 7 years of use of that dose, she was not getting very good pain control, and the dosage was increased to a total of 720 milligrams per day. And it's important to remember that at that time, there was no guideline, and there was no upper limit. The sky was the limit in terms of the dose that you could use. At the age of 62, that 720 milligrams of morphine was not working very well, and she was switched over to methadone. By age 63, she was on a total daily dose of 300 milligrams, and by age 70, this was up to almost 400 milligrams per day. By the age of 71, she was now on opioids for 16 years. Every time she came into my office, she looked terrible, and asking her, she said she felt horrible, and her husband said she talks funny. At that point, I sent a letter to her specialist and advised him of the situation and asked him to please give us direction to get her off this medication. And we'll come back to that later.
We're going to go on now to a brief history of opioids in medicine and society. And by way of justification, I'll show you this quote from George Santayana. He says, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now, the very first reference to opioids in the medical literature is about 4,000 years old. So there's a lot for us to remember and not repeat. So by the time Pliny the Elder was writing in the 1st century, we had already had 2,000 years worth of experience with opioids. And at that time, the use of opioids for chronic conditions become quite commonplace. Now, Pliny, he didn't have any epidemiological skills or resources, techniques. However, he did have something. He had clinical acumen. And using his clinical acumen, he was able to perceive the effect of opioid therapy on his population. And he concluded it was a deadly poison and its use should be condemned altogether. Now, leaving the Roman Empire, we'll go on to the British Empire. And in the mid-1700s, transoceanic trade would bring Britain and China together like never before. And when caffeine, the first psychostimulant, arrived in London for the very first time, it would sell for 6 times its weight in silver. Now, the reason tea from China was exchanged for silver was because at that time, China was the world's most advanced civilization, most advanced economy with over 40% of the world's GDP. So anything the British could make, the Chinese could make better and cheaper. So tea would flow from China to Britain and silver would flow back from Britain to China. Now, just because the British couldn't compete economically with China didn't mean they weren't going to get their money back. It just meant they'd have to use a different technique. So in the mid-18th century, they combined a state-sponsored monopoly with the production of an illicit drug with a smuggling network, and they fostered the creation of the opium trade. The results of that trade were spectacular economically. However, that pales in comparison to the human tragedy that this represents. This is a painting of the Chinese imperial family from the mid-1800s. And you'll see here in the middle of that painting, a guy dressed in gray. And that's probably Crown Prince. You can see he's about 12 years old in this painting. And like so many young people in Canada today, 1 week after his 23rd birthday, he would die from an opioid overdose. The emperor would seek to put an end to this illicit trade, and so he'd have his foreign minister, Commissioner Lin, write a very famous letter to Queen Victoria, and in it he says, by what principle of reason then should these foreigners send in return for tea, that is, a poisonous drug? What has become of that conscience which heaven has implanted in the breasts of all men? Now, I've never met a drug pusher who wasn't in favor of free trade, and the British were certainly no exception to that rule. They considered the Chinese position an affront to the principles of free trade. I'll draw your attention here to the corner of the left lower corner of this picture, and you'll see an opium pipe. And just in the squalor here, we'll come back to that later. So the British responded to the Chinese position exactly the way you'd expect the Hells Angels to respond to a warning sign from Neighborhood Watch that says bikers keep out. They responded not with one, but with 2 brutal opium wars. You see here William Gladstone. At the time of the outbreak of the first opium war, he was the leader of opposition. He would go on to become 4 times the Prime Minister of Britain. He addressed his parliament. He says, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated to cover this country in permanent disgrace, I do not know." Here's a picture of Helen. Helen is his sister. And at 24 years old, Helen suffered a near-fatal opioid overdose. So like the emperor, Gladstone had personal experience of opioid toxicity.
The First Opium War ended on August 29, 1842 with gunboat diplomacy at the mouth of the Pearl River. China was ordered to pay England $21 million in silver to compensate for losses of opium sales and interest, the cost of the war, and it also had to give open access to 5 ports. The casualties of that first war were about 25,000 Chinese to 69 British. And the prize of the Treaty of Nanking was Hong Kong Island, and this was gifted to England for 150 years, and it was a perfect hub for trade that opened the floodgates to import opium. It was finally returned to China in 1997. In a shocking display of historical ignorance, in 2016, then Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, sent a letter to the Chinese asking them to cut the flow of illicit opioids into British Columbia. Now you can imagine, had it been Alberta or Manitoba or any other province besides British something, it might have been able to slip by, but seeing as it came from British Columbia, the Chinese may have looked at that request and it may have reminded themselves of their own history. And it's possible they may have wrote Christy Clark back saying, sure, we may be able to help you, but first, hand over Vancouver Island.
Now, we know that Commissioner Lynn, for one, feels Christy Clark's pain, because in that letter in 1839, he says, you know, if this had happened to you, you would have reacted in anger and indignation to try and put an end to this. And honesty and accountability are not drug pushers' strong suit, and the British government was certainly no exception to that rule. So 50 years after the first Opium War, the opposition in London tries to hold the government accountable, and Sir J. Ferguson responds to the question with a total denial of the truth and any responsibility. Now, in the mid-1800s, we had the development of a new drug delivery system, and that would be the syringe and the hypodermic needle. Dr. Alexander Wood would become very famous for reporting the very first use of parenteral morphine for analgesia, and he became very famous. He would treat London high society and royalty. Unfortunately for Dr. Wood, he was never able to perceive the other face of opioid therapy, and for that he would pay a huge price. His wife Rebecca, of course, would be the first person to die from an opiate overdose. In 1900, Bayer would release a new opioid on the market. It was called heroin, and based on absolutely no science whatsoever, it was marketed as a less addictive substitute to morphine. We'll see how that turns out. It becomes banned in most countries in the world subsequently. Now, in a move that would disappoint George Santayana, not even 100 years later, Purdue releases their new opioid on the market, and based on no science whatsoever, again, it is marketed as being less addictive than the alternatives, and we'll come back to that later again. So going back to China now, by 1906, the opium trade had completely decimated the Chinese civilization. 23% of the adult male and 3.5% of the adult female population were opium users. China was consuming 85 to 95% of the global opium. In fact, the World Drug Report from 2008 by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they state, never before or since has the world known a drug problem of this scale and intensity. Now, I'm going to put this into perspective for you. Presently in North America, we have an opioid crisis, and it's attracting the attention of our media every day. In fact, life expectancy in North America for the first time in decades has consistently fallen due to the opioid crisis. Now, remember that 23%? We have, our prevalence of opioid use disorder in North America is about 2%. So however bad it is for us in North America now, whatever the Chinese experience was probably an order of magnitude worse. This history is taught in China today under the heading of a century of humiliation. It took just over 100 years for this economic powerhouse with over 40% of the world's GDP to fall to less than 7% of the world's GDP. In fact, opium became the largest international commerce in any single commodity anywhere in the world. Now, I'll challenge you here. Try and imagine what commodity fits that bill today.
This company that's listed on the Forbes 500, Jardine Matheson Holdings, was originally founded by Dr. William Jardine and James Matheson in 1832. And those two individuals were responsible with their company for approximately 1/6 of the illicit trade in opium into China. Today, and this is from 2018 or 19, in their listing, they still have over 400,000 employees with a market cap into the billions. And what this illustrates is the how drug money just lives on over time.
So, My challenge, if you guessed the automobile, you got it. So when we think of our predecessors at the beginning of the 20th century facing the challenge of how to put an end to the opium trade, that is the equivalent for us when we imagine trying to put an end to the automobile trade today. Now, for those of you who've had some experience with recovery, you know about rock bottom, that term. And that's that term when you, in the life of someone who's got an addiction, where you finally take stock and you realize, you know what, this ain't working. I'm totally powerless over my addiction, and here's what it's cost me. And it's cost me my stature, it's cost me my life, my relationship, my job, all this kind of stuff. And about 1906, despite decades of trying to control their own opium consumption, China finally admitted, we can't do this. We need help. China reached out to the rest of the world for help. And luckily for everybody, it was Reverend Charles Brent from Newcastle, Ontario, who answered that call. Reverend Brent had been the Bishop of Manila previously, and there he was able to see the impact of the opium trade on a population. And he was also able to implement some measures that would mitigate the toxicity of opioids on that population. Now, Reverend Brent, like others before him, could see that opium was a deadly poison. But unlike others, he had a perception, a different perception. And that perception led to the creation of a new paradigm. And I'm pretty sure you used that paradigm yourself in the last 24 hours. And that paradigm is he perceived, and that perception is that he understood opium as a global environmental toxin. And as such, it would require a coordinated multinational approach to control the toxicity. Now, at that very first International Opium Commission, the British Empire was represented by William Lyon Mackenzie King. He would later become Prime Minister of Canada, and it's not surprising that Canada in 1908 became the first country to limit the opium trade with legislation introduced by Mackenzie King. This would be followed in 1914 by the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act in the United States. Both of these acts together would reduce enormously the amount of opioids available in North America. And under the provisions of this act, some 5,000 physicians would be convicted in the United States annually in the 20s and 30s. After the International Opium Commission in 1909, we had in 1912, we had the very first drug control treaty passed at the International Opium Convention in The Hague. Subsequently, we have the two intervening world wars. Reverend Brent would die in 1929. However, his vision lives on after him. And in 1953, we had an opium protocol that was signed. In 1961, we had a single convention on narcotic drugs adopted. There are now some 183 countries that are signatories to its protocols, and we had the creation of the International Narcotics Control Board. These are the fruits of Reverend Charles Brent's labors. You can see that as a species in 1906, we were exposed to some 42,000 tons of opium. 100 years later, that number's down to about 12,000 tons. And in the same time period, the world's population has more than quadrupled. Now, Reverend Brent's legacy includes two things. So one, the change in the prevalence of opioid use disorder. In 1906, we were at 1.5% of the world's population having opioid use disorder. 100 years later, that's a sixth of that number, 0.25. Try and remember that opioid use disorder typically affects people in their 20s and 30s, and it has a mortality rate about 15 times standard mortality. If you try and think about that and you spread it over 100 years, the impact on quality adjusted life years must be astronomical. That's one of his legacies. But the other legacy that he has is that when we approach global environmental toxins like asbestos and CO2 levels, we use Reverend Charles Brent's success and his paradigm to address those same issues.
This is the Opium War Memorial at the mouth of the Pearl River in Hunan, China. This monument stands about 40 feet tall and is a symbol of the emancipation of China from under British opium trade. And you can see it is held by two huge concrete fists.
All right, so we're going to go on to the evidence for the effectiveness of opioids in the treatment of chronic non-cancer pain. And very, very specifically, we are not talking about acute pain. We're not talking about cancer pain. We're not talking about end-of-life care. All right, so what does the evidence show? This is a study done by Steinman, and Steinman asks house staff, he says, how much influence do sales representatives have on your prescribing? 1% of a sale lot. And then he goes on to say, how much influence do sales representatives have on other physicians prescribing? We say 51%. So the evidence quite clearly documents a blind spot when it comes to our relationship with industry. And we're going to keep that blind spot in mind as we go on to look at the creation of guidelines. All right, so in 2010, McMaster generated the very first Canadian guidelines. Unfortunately, some 21 out of the 49 panel members had direct ties to industry. 17 of those ties were with Purdue Pharma. And not surprisingly, opioids were found to be safe and effective. And in fact, the sky was the limit as far as dosing was concerned. Now, in 2016, Deborah Dowell at the CDC created a new set of guidelines. And these represent really the gold standard in how to mitigate the effect of bias on the creation of a guideline. Very, very specifically, they excluded experts who had a financial or promotional relationship with a company that makes a product that might be affected by the guidelines. And the work that they did is absolutely stellar. Now, strangely enough, despite the fact that that work was stellar and there was no new data that came out in 2017, the Canadian taxpayer decided to send McMaster over $500,000 to come up with our own guidelines in Canada. And from the get-go, the Canadians were not that interested or concerned about limiting this blind spot. So they said, we elected to comprise the voting panels of individuals without overt financial or intellectual conflicts of interest. Anyway, having lowered the ethical bar, they still couldn't even hit that. And the issue came up in the House of Commons. Now, Gord Guyot from McMaster did acknowledge the errors and he did apologize. McMaster did not return the money and the guidelines were not redone. But we did get this statement from McMaster and he said exactly what you'd figure he'd say based on Steinman. He said, that conflict of interest thing, it might have affected other people, but it probably wouldn't have affected us. So let's look at those guidelines and to see if there's any effect that you can see. Now, there were 8 key questions in the CDC guidelines, and the first and the most important question they asked themselves were, are there any studies that address outcomes at 1 year? And the answer in 2016 was no. Of course, 2018, we had the SPACE trial published, and despite being slightly biased in favor of opioids, it showed that, of course, people who received opioids for chronic non-cancer pain had worse function and worse pain at the end of the year. But in 2017, when we were making our Canadian guidelines, did we ask key question number 1 in Canada? And strangely enough, the answer is no. Why is that?
And addressing this specific question, the CMAJ published a letter from Dr. Jason Bussey, who is the author of our 2017 guidelines. And in that, he addressed the limitations of the CDC guidelines for prescribing opiates for non-cancer pain. And in his letter, he stated that the CDC guidelines had excessive restriction on selecting evidence in that they restricted 100 or more studies, excluded them, randomized control trials of shorter durations. And on average, that shorter duration was about 5 weeks. And we'll come back to that concept later.
All right, so let's look at those guidelines a little carefully. So the CDC in 2016, non-pharmacologic therapy and non-opioid pharmacologic therapy are preferred for chronic pain. They go on to say that you should consider opioid therapy only if the expected benefits of both pain and function are anticipated to outweigh the risks. They say don't go over 90 and use caution over going over 50 milligrams per day. Now let's look at the Canadian guidelines. Okay, so they say when considering therapy for chronic non-cancer pain, we recommend optimization of non-opioid pharmacotherapy and non-pharmacological therapy rather than a trial of opioids. Very similar, right? And then they say don't go over 90 milligrams rather than no upper limit. So that looks very, very similar. It's in recommendation number 2 that the Canadians really distinguish themselves. So let me read it. For patients with chronic non-cancer pain without current or past substance use disorder and without other active psychiatric disorders who have persistent problematic pain despite optimized non-opioid therapy, we suggest adding a trial of opioids rather than continued therapy without opioids. Now, in that recommendation, they go on to tell us that likely this is going to result in little or no difference in their pain and little or no difference in their function. However, there's a downside. About 5.5% of them will have addiction. And somewhere between 1 in 550 and 1 in 32 of your patients will be dead in 2.6 years. So if you put it all together, they're suggesting that you harm your patient for absolutely no benefit. And this is a contravention of the World Medical Association Declaration of Geneva and one of the basic principles of medicine, first, do no harm. I have never found a recommendation that suggests that we harm our patients for no benefit. Changing gears, this is work done by Leonard Pelosi at the CDC, and he's really confirming the observations of the Roman physicians 2,000 years ago, which is that opioids act on a population like a deadly poison. So the green line shows the number of kilograms of opioids sold in the United States, and the blue line shows the people who died from opioid overdose. And then the purple line underneath shows admission for opioid treatment. And the lines are actually quite parallel. Unfortunately, they kept going up and up and up, and they're about at 15 per 100,000 in 2017.
This is data from the CDC, which is displaying where America stood in 1999 initially. And the gray color indicates 0 to 4 deaths per 100,000, and the darker magenta is over 20 per 100,000. So in 1999, you can see what the color of America looked like, and by 2014, this is what it looked like.
So this is a meta-analysis and a systematic review done by Louisa Degenhardt. It's very important. It's prospective. There are 57 prospective trials, and these are people who have opioid use disorder. They're both injecting and non-injecting. Duration anywhere from 1 to 36 years, some 292,000 people. And what she finds is that for every 1 overdose death, there are 2 other deaths. Those 2 other deaths are things like endocarditis or drownings or fires or a whole bunch of stuff. So that when we talked about the earlier rate of some 15 per 100,000 in terms of preventable deaths, it's more like 45 per 100,000. She also found that the mortality rate for people with opioid use disorder is some 14.6 times standard. And I'll put that into perspective for you. People with breast cancer have a more standardized mortality of about 12. So this is worse than breast cancer.
Narcotic neurotoxicity. Back in 1893, T.D. Crothers wrote in his book, "We cannot yet trace the early causes and cell conditions which developed the opium craze," and he went on to say that some central brain degeneration has begun and is going on. In 1905, Emil Kraepelin, the father of modern psychiatry, wrote in his letter on morphinism that it's certain that every doctor consider it the highest principle of his professional duty not to injure his patient, and he says that he was to introduce us today to in 1904 to no small group of psychical disturbances originated almost exclusively by the indiscretion of medical men. He went on to describe a case of a 44-year-old farmer who received a gunshot wound, injured the sciatic nerve, and he necessitated a series of cures at health resorts. We might call those pain clinics today. And he was given morphine from the first of his injury, and he had been on it for 16 years. And he states that, as is always the case, the patient finds his dependence on it very troublesome, and that he has a lively wish to be freed from it because it doesn't do anything to help his pain, but only gets rid of the suffering of going off the remedy, which is withdrawal. Kreplin then states that as far as all they know from experiments about the psychical effect of morphine, that it made the course of thought easier, but rendered the carrying out of the impulses more difficult, and so impulsive volition more difficult, and so disabled the will. 100 years later, in 1999, published in Synapse, Robinson describes how morphine alters the structure of neurons in the nucleus accumbens and neocortex, and they found that morphine decreased the complexity of dendritic branching in the shell of the nucleus accumbens. 10 years later, from the Harvard Pain Group, again looking at the same issue of brain structure and functional connectivity, found out that compared to controls, there's bilateral loss of volume in the amygdala and decreased functional connectivity, particularly in the nucleus accumbens and amygdala. And they also found that the longer the duration of exposure to opioids, there was a greater change in functional connectivity. The implications of this is that these drugs not only affect specific structure, but entire systems that mediate reward, addiction, motivation, etc. The nucleus accumbens and amygdala, well, the amygdala is the center for emotions, emotional behavior, and motivation. The nucleus accumbens is part of the classic reward circuitry and is involved in reward-seeking behavior. What in particular does the nucleus accumbens do? And this is critical in understanding the big picture here. The nucleus accumbens has dendritic projections that get information in real time and from all over the body. It measures pH, osmolality, PO2, PCO2, hormonal balance, caloric balance, temperature, and so on. And to understand this, you have to think that if your osmolality goes up a little bit, you might be, even in the middle of this talk, be tempted to go get a glass of water. If your caloric balance is down a bit, you might also grab a sandwich. If this goes on to a higher degree, if your osmolality goes way up, you might even be tempted to drink salt water. And if your caloric balance drops far enough, a human will be tempted to eat almost anything to survive. So the net result of this is that the nucleus accumbens is responsible for everything that evolution has done to ensure your survival. The toxic effect of morphine causes these branches to be pruned. The net result is that the drive center is being disconnected from the person, and the normal physiologic drives are being replaced by a pathological drive, opioids. So the next time that you see an image of a person with drug addiction laying on the streets in Vancouver, not properly dressed, not eating properly, not drinking properly, and you ask yourself, how could this be? You have to understand that they're suffering from an acquired brain injury.
The nucleus accumbens is a remarkably precise organ, and we may believe some of the lies we tell ourselves about the impact of pharmaceutically sponsored meals on our behavior, but the nucleus accumbens is much more precise. And you can see here in the study done by Hadland, we're looking at the bottom line, we're looking at the number of meals received from pharma in 2014. A year later, we're looking at the prescriptions of those physicians, and you can see that the nucleus accumbens knows whether it was 3 meals or 6 meals or not. A very precise organ. Now, if you're going to measure toxicity, right, you have to know what the organ does, and you have to have some kind of a measure of what the organ system does. So if I gave you examples about eyes and kidneys and hearts and lungs, you got an idea of what we're doing. If what you know about the nucleus accumbens, what is it that we would measure to measure a drug that's specifically toxic to that organ? Well, survival, right? And that's exactly the endpoint that the Roman physicians could see. There's something wrong with these people's survival.
In 1893, remember what Crothers said? Some central brain degeneration has begun and is going on. And Emil Kreplin talked about how the psychical effect of morphine was to disable the will. It's absolutely astounding how those two physicians over 100 years ago were able to use their clinical acumen to understand exactly what was happening. It reminds me of Isaac Newton's quote, "If I have seen farther than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants."
All right, so we're going to go on to narcotic-induced hyperalgesia. And 150 years ago, the Alonzo Calkinans, we already knew that opioids cause pain. When I teach and I talk to residents and medical students about the fact that opioids cause pain, they look at me like I have two heads. You mean that it's as if I'm telling them that insulin is going to raise somebody's blood sugar. It's nothing they're familiar with. And yet 150 years ago, we knew this. And you can see here in this quote that he already knew 150 years ago that this was a neuropathic problem. He says twinges as from electric sparks shoot along the nerve fibrils. So we already know that it causes hyperalgesia. And here in 2016, Lorianne Rakela is showing us at the level of the tetrasynapse all the different places, those little red dots are where morphine acts to cause a dysregulation at the level of the tetrasynapse in the pain system. Now, we're clinicians, we're not basic scientists, so what does this look like clinically? So here's a study done by Doherty, and he's looking at two endpoints for people who are exposed to opioids and who aren't. So the clear bars are the people who are the control groups, the black bars are the people on methadone, and what we're going to do is we're going to insert their forearms into an ice water bath, and they're going to report two things. One, when do you first feel pain? And two, how long can you possibly leave your forearms in the bath? And as you can see at both 0 hours and 3 hours, the people who aren't on the opioid perceive pain later, and they are much more tolerant to pain, as you can see. Now, if opioids make us more sensitive to pain and less tolerant to pain, what happens when you take people off opioids? Okay, so this is a systematic review done by Frank, and he's looking at all of the 8 studies that with over 5,000 patients to study what happens to people. And in each one of these studies, every single one of them, people's pain is reported as being less, and their function improves as you take people off the opioids. Now, I have to say, the quality of evidence is fair. Why? Because it's not a randomized controlled trial.
So how did we get here? How did the marketing of opioids affect us? I remember back in 2000 when the pharmaceutical reps were still allowed in my office, and this article was brought in by the Purdue Pharma reps on OxyContin. And the article was on controlled release oxycodone therapy and osteoarthritis. And at the time, this was accepted as legitimate research. 10 years later, when I started to question my use of this class of drugs for chronic pain, I went back and looked at this article again a little bit more critically. What I found was a couple of things. Firstly was the last author here. It should be noted that this individual, Lacouture, was employed by Purdue Pharma, and the article itself was actually sponsored by Purdue Pharma. This is a book that was given to me as well by the representatives, and this book's about an inch thick. It was a Canadian edition, and inside the book cover it was stated that it was a grant from Purdue Pharma that was responsible for development and printing of the book. And there's 2 names that I want you to look at on the cover of this book. One is at the bottom, and that's Dr. Russell Portnoy, who we talked about earlier, and the other one's in the middle of the book. Dr. Russell Portnoy, remember his Wall Street Journal article, a couple of things that he said back 20 years after he initially talked about opioids was that he said, "I gave innumerable lectures in the late 1980s and 90s about addiction that weren't true. The corollary to that, of course, is that they were false." And he also stated that if he had only had an inkling of what he knew now then, he wouldn't have spoke the way he did. It was clearly the wrong thing to do. Well, an inkling is just like a subtle hint that you might know something's in the background. Well, if we go back actually to Upsher's comment in the danger of in the use of opium, he says the dangers in the reckless use of opium in prescribing should be impressed upon students in their college days. That's published in JAMA 1900. So we've already been there. We knew that. This graph is a motion curve, and it comes from data from the International Narcotics Control Board. And you can pick any country in the world and go to that country and look at the change in prescribing over time in that country. And we've chosen Canada here, and the bottom axis is that of years, and it starts in 1964. And the vertical axis on the left is the milligram morphine equivalent that is sold in Canada each year for every living individual. And so we'll start the curve and follow it and see where it runs over time. So you can see back in 1970, we're about 17 for every individual. By 1980, we're still around that number. Then things start to change.
Let's highlight a couple of spots on that graph there. Henry and I graduated in the 1980s, and that's the same time when Russell Portnoy published his first article promoting the use of opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. On Friday, December 12th, 1995 at 4 p.m., Curtis Wright signed off on the OxyContin approval for the FDA. Interestingly enough, Curtis went on to have another employer, and I'll let you figure out who that would be.
In 2007, Purdue Pharma pled guilty to felony misbranding OxyContin and was ordered to pay at that time a $600 million fine. By the end of this curve in 2014, Canada is almost at 1,000. Remember, we started at 18 or 19 back in the 1960s. And in 2014, China is still down at 7. Another thing to remember is that in 2014, if you go to the RCMP website in Canada, it's at that time that they draw light to the fact that fentanyl hits the streets of British Columbia in 2014. So this entire curve that you're looking at here is pharma and physician generated. These three guys, we have Howard on the left, the lawyer, Dr. Paul, there always appears to be a doctor somewhere embedded in here, and Mike, the president of Purdue in the United States. And these three individuals collectively had to pay about a $36 million fine on top of the original $600 million. Purdue Pharma pled guilty to felony misbranding OxyContin with the intent to defraud and mislead. In 2020, November 2020, the United States Department of Justice put out this release that Purdue Pharma pled guilty again to fraud and kickback conspiracies. And in fact, at this time, the company is in bankruptcy, and there are over 3,000 jurisdictions trying to access over $10 billion in money from the company. The Canadian provinces have also launched legal action against the pharmaceutical companies in the States regarding the opioid crisis, and that is to the tune of over $68 billion. The CBC Fifth Estate is an investigative journalist program, and the Canadian Broadcasting Company did this in 2012 on the marketing of OxyContin. And during that time when I was interviewed, Lyndon McIntyre noticed my book, and he noticed in particular a name on it, and that was the one that was in the middle of that book, and that was Dr. Brian Goldman. And 2 weeks after that, Dr. Goldman printed an article in the Globe and Mail commenting about how his name was mentioned on the program, and he said that he was part of Big Pharma's big influence, and in particular, he says, Purdue Pharma took note of his growing expertise in the field, and it offered to sponsor some of his talks. I wonder whether it also took notice of the fact that he was a national radio celebrity talk show host and that thousands of doctors and individuals listened to his program regularly. But he went on to say, I no longer believe it possible for educational courses paid for by drug companies to be free of corporate bias.
All right, so let's look at the role now of opioids in treating chronic non-cancer pain. And we were often taught to try opioids, and if one patient doesn't respond to one opioid, try another. So these are the opioids available in Canada today. And there's another one here I want to show you. How about this one? Do you know what this is? Right, this is heroin, and it's licensed in the UK. Now I want you to do a little thought experiment with me here. I want you to imagine you sitting down with your patient and explaining to them why you think treating their pain today with heroin is a good idea, and the benefits outweigh the risks. So do that little thought experiment for me. Great. Hang on to it. So let's look at the Salome trial. This was done in Vancouver, and this is a double-blind randomized trial with 200 people who have intravenous heroin addiction. And half of them get hydromorphone, half of them get heroin, and at the end of the 12-month trial, basically, half of the people who got heroin thought they were getting hydromorphone, and half of the people who were getting hydromorphone thought that they were getting heroin. The conclusion is heroin and hydromorphone are completely indistinguishable. So the next time you write a prescription for Dilaudid or hydromorph content, it should line up with that little vignette you did 2 slides ago. And if it doesn't line up with that clinical scenario, you got to ask yourself, well, why?
I want to go back to our case study now. Back in 2009, I received a letter from my patient's pain specialist, and at that time, he noted that she was using a wheelchair in the mall. Her gait was stooped and antalgic. She had difficulty getting down the hall in his office, which was about 50 feet. And if you remember at that time, my advice was sent back to take this individual off methadone, as the harms that she was enduring had to be dealt with. 10 months later, in September 2010, she is now off the methadone. She needed to use Suboxone or buprenorphine for several months to deal with the withdrawal. However, when she went back to see the specialist and she's now off everything, he noted that she can walk with a single cane for 30 minutes now. And it was a major achievement to get this woman off methadone, since in retrospect it was not helping her pain at all. And the specialist thanked me for suggesting that she go off, and stated that it was a major learning experience for him. Also interesting to note, a year after she was off her methadone, she and her husband traveled to Europe. So I thought I was pretty smart being able to pull this off and to get her off that, and how it changed her life. And I told Mark about this case, my case, and he sent me back another interesting case study. And again, a 40-year-old woman who was on morphine for 17 years. And her family physician advised her and her husband that it'd be impossible to endure the suffering of going off the morphine because she was on it so long. But she still had a great desire to be free of it, and they gradually tapered it off till she did get off. And a year and a half since she discontinued it, her husband informed the doctor she was in better health than she'd been for 20 years and had no need for any drugs whatsoever. So what do we learn from this? Now, first of all, it goes back to 1900. And secondly, deprescribing is a novel concept, again from 1900. RateMDs is a website where you can go and look up your family physician, or any physician for that matter, and see what their patients are commenting on their experience with that individual. And often I would show my medical students my site. And in 2019, when I was doing that, showing my medical student, this comment showed up. And I was rather stunned to see this written on my RateMD site. And I blocked out the name. However, the mother wrote, "My son visited Chapeskie for toe surgery. He was prescribed 40 oxycodone pills. I questioned Dr. Chapeskie about the drug, and he reassured me it was not addictive. We were told that if you have pain, you can't get addicted." And she went on to say that 10 years later, her son died of an opioid overdose in his bed. Now, myself as a physician individually was called out on the effect of that one prescription, what it did to that individual 10 years later. I want to draw your attention to another case of a patient of mine who went to the emergency room, And at that time, he went in with an abscess. He was a self-employed individual with the family. And he was given 10 Percocets on the way home after his abscess was dealt with. He said that it found that it helped him get going, so he started buying more, and eventually buying Oxy Neo and up to 400 milligrams a day from his 74-year-old broker. I asked him about the term, and he said, oh yes, he buys and sells opioids from lots of people. So he got to the point that he spent over 6 years approximately $300,000. It almost destroyed himself and his family. He told me he was functioning well, working 7 days a week till 3 or 4 in the morning. He was too busy to go to detox, and he couldn't tolerate the withdrawal to be able to quit. And his wife and family were in crying. And finally, he got onto buprenorphine in 2016, and he got off all medications completely. The difference between my situation and this one is that this doctor is completely unaware of what that one prescription bottle did to that individual and that family. How many physicians have written a prescription for a small bottle of opioids and are completely oblivious to what has happened to those individuals some 5 or 10 years down the road?
This is an article in the Globe and Mail published by Dr. Dorothy Bacher. She's an associate professor at McMaster University. And in this article, she tells of how her son dies of a fentanyl overdose. And importantly, she says, never once did they say my son had a serious disease. Now, you have to understand, you have to go through a university and get a degree, and then go to medical school, and then go to residency, and then become an associate professor. And throughout that entire process, never will you understand in Canada, in the Canadian medical education system, that opioid use disorder is a serious disorder. This is a complete indictment of the Canadian medical education system. All right, so we're going to wrap up a little bit here. We're going to cover key myth number 1. And basically the myth here is that the current opioid epidemic is a new phenomenon. Its drivers are complex and difficult to understand. No, this is not a new phenomenon. We've been here before as a species, and the drivers aren't that hard to understand. Key myth number 2, opioids relieve chronic pain. There is absolutely no evidence that opioids relieve chronic pain. In fact, the evidence would suggest that opioids cause chronic pain. All right, this is a really important concept, and I want to tie this in with what you think about air pollution. We understand that air pollution can damage people's lungs, and that people who have damaged lungs suffer the most consequences from air pollution. I want you to think about opioids the way we think about air pollution. It's an environmental toxin. So on the left arm of that curve, you see that as the toxin, the sulfur dioxide, goes up in the atmosphere, this is the London smog from 1952, as the toxin goes up, the mortality rate goes up. And I'm going to argue with you that Leonard Pelosi has shown us that exact pattern. As opioids increase in the environment, more people die from them. We don't have data from the downside of the curve, but I am going to suggest that the work of Reverend Charles Brent effectively proved this, that when we lower the ambient concentration of opioids in the environment, less people die from opioid overdose. The next concept, opioid toxicity is measured in years and decades. So on the left of the screen here, we've got the evidence-based gurus. And they're really smart. They can tell you the difference between the forest plot and the funnel plot and the Ewell-Simpson effect and a whole bunch of stuff. But they're totally isolated from their population. They don't have any clinical acumen. So for them, they can't see what Pliny the Elder, who doesn't know what standard deviation is, but he's got clinical acumen and he's connected to his population, he can see opioids are toxic. The evidence-based people have no idea.
So let's ask a stupid question. Here's an advertisement for Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes dating back to 1882. And at that time, they were advertised for your health to treat paroxysms of asthma, foul breath, hay fever, diseases of the throat, and so on. And interestingly, not recommended for children under 6. So what's our stupid question? Well, is smoking 1 pack per day safe and effective? And let's do some randomized control trials from 5 weeks to 50 weeks on smoking a pack per day. And we'll do 100 of them. And if you remember back to the criticism of the CDC guidelines, there were over 100 studies that were not included that were 5 weeks long in the use of opioids for treating non-cancer pain. So with smoking, what's our expected results? Well, nobody is dead. There'll be no change in FEV1. Most people enjoy it, especially after a nice meal. And it seems to help some people's cough, the anticholinergic effect. And they function the same or better. So what's the conclusion? Smoking 1 pack per day is safe and effective. Dr. Batty was right. Or is it the single most toxic product to human health on the planet as we know it to be? What this example shows is, in the same way with opioids, our evidence-based medicine specialists have a profound misunderstanding of the time it takes for opioids to exert their toxic effect on people.
All right. So based on the evidence, what do we know about opioids for chronic non-cancer pain? Well, there's absolutely no evidence to support the use of opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. 0. We know that patients function better off them. We know from the neuroanatomy and all this imaging, the opioids are neurotoxic to the nucleus accumbens of all things. We know that opioids cause pain. They induce hyperalgesia. We know that opioids aren't safe either, are toxic to both the individual and the society. We know that. Opioids are neither safe nor effective for chronic non-cancer pain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.